Greetings and welcome to a new video by me. I've had a whole bunch of messages over these last couple of months asking about modes. So I felt it might be a good idea to actually do a video on the modes. There's a whole bunch of videos already, but I think maybe my way of explaining things might be a little bit more clearer, or maybe just my approach to this kind of stuff might be more useful to you. So today we're going to talk about modes. Yay! Okay, first of all, what is a mode? There seems to be a little bit of confusion between a mode and a scale. Generally speaking, a mode tends to come from a scale. So by that I mean, if I was to take a scale and rather than start on the first note but start on a different note, I would essentially get a mode of that scale. And as such, you have literally thousands, or I should say hundreds of thousands of scales, modes throughout the world, and that's where the kind of blur between what a mode is and what a scale is. Okay, but the focus today, at least, will be on the 7 modes of the Western major scale. Okay, so the major scale and its 7 modes, as it were, come from the church, as does a lot of music from that kind of the Western world, as it were. And as such, because of its relation to the church and that era, the 7 modes are appropriately named from the kind of the Pythagorean Greek kind of stuff. So although there are 7 modes, technically speaking, we're only going to be actually looking at 4. Okay. The reason for that being, the very first mode that you get from the 7 modes is Ionian, which is basically the Greek Pythagorean name for the major scale. Okay, and you should kind of know your major scale by now. If you don't, then you really shouldn't be watching this video. You should go back and be learning your major scale. So already we know our first mode, which is our major scale. The 7th mode, Locrian, we're not going to be looking at, just because unless you're into your kind of jazz, fusion-y kind of stuff, then you really aren't going to be using it right now. It's kind of a mode that you will kind of want to learn later on when you get into more diminished tonalities and more kind of, chordal substitution kind of tricks and stuff. So for now, we're looking at 6 modes and really know one of them. And technically speaking, you probably know the other one, okay, which is Aeolian, which is the fancy name for the minor scale. Okay, so major and minor scale, that's already kind of 2 modes. So we are really only left with 4. Okay, now the thing is, when we start looking at modes and understanding modes better and actually getting modal sounds, we need to start looking at the concept of intervals. Okay, now intervals are kind of the bread and butter of all music theory. They are essentially the colors, if you will, that you use to paint music. And it's through the use of intervals that you are able to create, sounds which affect people, in a certain way, which is beyond just kind of playing regular kind of major and minor sounds. There's a reason why, certain kinds of classical music or certain kinds of world music have, effects on a person's overall mood or, general well-being, and that's associated with the use of intervals. Okay, but not to go too deep down that road. But we do, however, need to understand that when we start studying modes, although we're playing scales, we are going to start focusing on very specific intervals, very specific tones throughout the scale. So let's get started with our first of these four modes that we're going to be looking at. Okay, the very first mode that we're going to look at is Dorian. Dorian is basically a minor scale in its nature, but it differs from the minor scale. And primarily these four modes that we're going to be looking at, they're either major or minor in nature, and they generally tend to only have one note that is different from their kind of major or minor brethren. But it's that one note, that one interval, that really makes that mode, you know, stand out and sound very different from a regular major or minor scale. Okay, and that's the case with Dorian. Okay, so Dorian is technically a minor scale, but because of its intervallic nature, we end up with a major 6 as opposed to a minor 6. So a regular minor scale would have, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's my minor 6. Okay, whereas Dorian has a major 6, so that would be generally, you know, sound-wise, when I tend to think of Dorian, I tend to kind of think of kind of monks chanting, that kind of, or the Halo theme tune, if you will. But monks chanting, basically, that's kind of that sound, you know, the kind of the minor sound, but that major 6 kind of throwing you that kind of, you know. Okay, so the third mode we're going to be looking at, of the major scale, which is our second mode. So don't get confused by these. I don't mean second or third, blah blah. Even then, it's actually not really relevant. We just want to kind of think of the modes individually for now. Okay. So this next one we're going to look at is called Phrygian. Okay. Refrigerator. Phrygian is basically a minor scale. But the one note which is different this time is that we have a flat second. So this would be like my regular minor scale. Okay, and this would be Phrygian. Generally speaking, Phrygian tends to have that kind of minor, kind of, people will relate to kind of Spanish and flamenco kind of sound, which is a fairly reasonable kind of association. It's not, you know, flamenco tends to be far more complicated than just having, you know, they throw in a lot more than just a minor second into their music. It's far more sophisticated than that, but it has a Spanish flavor, if you will. Okay, so those are the two minor modes that you will be looking to kind of use in your musical vocabulary. Let's take a look now at the two major modes that we have. Okay, an important one, especially when you start getting into kind of more kind of chordal approaches and major kind of harmony, would be Lydian, because Lydian is the fourth mode of major scale. And it differs to a regular major scale in that it has a raised fourth, or a sharp fourth, or a augmented fourth, depending on your chosen kind of vocabulary, as it were. Okay, so here's a regular major scale. And here is now Lydian with its raised fourth. tends to have that kind of dreamy kind of sound. It's kind of used for very kind of cloudscapey kind of, you know, it just has a very kind of enigmatic. But obviously this boils down to context. For me also, when I hear Lydian, I kind of think of The Simpsons. But yeah, you can forget about that. Okay, the last one is Mixolydian, which is the fifth mode of the major scale. Mixolydian is basically a major scale, but that one note which is different is now a seventh. So instead of a major seven, we have a flattened seventh, or a minor seventh. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing that we get with this mode, and this is kind of relating to chordal theory, that we end up with a major third ringing against a minor seven. Okay, and that's a very important kind of combination of two notes there, because that kind of gives us a kind of mixture of kind of major and minor sounds. So if I kind of get my, okay, so that's my major third, C sharp, and then you have, I guess that's my minor seven now, flat seven, and you end up with this, which is a tritone. Okay, and if you don't know what a tritone is, I suggest you look it up. It's something which you will inevitably have to study a lot if you're going to get into kind of very heavy chordal theory, especially if you're going to get into jazz. Okay, and jazz composition, the tritone is kind of, it's a big thing there. Okay, so at this scale we end up with a tritone, which is kind of, in this case, it gives us the combination of a major third against a flattened or minor seventh, a dominant sound, if you will. Okay, very big thing in blues. So this is kind of the major scale. And now here's my Mixolydian scale. Okay, now when it's used in that kind of context, there are some people who say Mixolydian has kind of an Indian kind of sound, which is a fairly good analysis, because a lot of the rajas or ragas, depending on how you want to pronounce it, tend to actually be based off a kind of a Mixolydian kind of thing. Obviously there's variations in the intonation of the scales, because they're playing instruments which aren't Western, so the notes aren't exactly tuned the right way, but essentially it's that kind of, you know, okay, kind of a poor imitation there, but you get the idea. Okay, so now we have these kind of four modes to play with. We now actually want to start using these modes in a way which is more compelling and more kind of useful. Because there's this very bad habit that we get into when we're learning a scale or particularly a mode, that we just kind of want to play up and down, just go. You know, that's kind of a very monotonous and very dangerous way to learn modes, because I see this a lot, especially on a lot of YouTube videos, where someone says, yeah, I'm using this mode, and you know, they'll be kind of playing up here, and then they'll kind of launch into this box pattern that they've kind of practiced a lot. You know, when you do that, you're not really playing modally, you're just kind of playing a scale. And specifically with modes, if you're not careful, it will sound like basically either a major or minor scale, because an example of that would be if I take my Dorian scale Okay, so let me take a D Dorian scale. If someone plays a C major chord, and I play this scale the way I did just now, it basically just sounds like a C major scale, and I'm basically emphasizing the wrong note. Okay. The usage of modes comes back to what I was saying earlier about intervals. There are certain intervals which I really need to target to get the best out of each of these modes. With Dorian, it was that, that raised 6 or that major 6 against the minor third. With the Phrygian, it was the emphasis of a minor second against the root. With Lydian, it was the kind of that sharp form resolving either up to a perfect fifth or down to a major third. And with mixed Lydian, it was that kind of flat seventh major third kind of root thing. Okay. Now that might sound kind of complicated, but it really isn't. All it just means is that you have to pay attention to what you're playing as opposed to just kind of ripping up and down the neck. Okay. And when you start to do that and target certain intervals, it actually starts to sound like you're playing very specific music. I'm not just kind of going. No, I'm going to actually be playing, I could talk about the usage of modes and kind of really analyze them very deeply, but that's kind of not the point of this. I just wanted to touch upon what the modes are and how to get started, okay? And to leave off on the whole kind of modal thing, and kind of the last thing that you want to really be doing with the modes is kind of what we kind of refer to as modal interchange, or kind of parallel modality, blah blah blah. Very fancy technical terms for basically what it means is if I'm playing a scale, I will kind of keep my root note of that scale, but then I'll change the scale to a mode. Okay, so what that basically means is if someone's playing an A minor chord, the vanilla thing to do there would be to play just to play a regular kind of A minor scale against an A minor chord. Okay, because there are no kind of the intervals in certain modes, because they're not in that chord, I can get away now with implying these modes. So if someone was to play this minor chord, I can actually get away with playing Dorian over this. I'm also able to get away with playing Phrygian. Okay, and that's because I'm kind of filling in the gaps. Chords are based off of structures of thirds. Which usually means a lot of these kind of modal sounds in the first octave at least kind of fill in the missing gaps. So if I have a basic chord, it's going to be 1, 3, 5, and 7. And those modal sounds that we were talking about were based off a flat second, or a major 6 or a sharp 4. Okay. Now obviously there is a limitation to that. Like I said, if it's a minor chord, then I need to use a minor mode, either the Dorian or the Phrygian. If someone plays this, I can't launch into, because of that major third, the the sharp 4 is a cool sound there, and I could get away with that. But the rest of the scale isn't going to work because it's basically the wrong note. You know, there are certain rules to these things where you can kind of bend them and get around them, but in the kind of beginning, we stick to the fact that if it's a minor chord, I have to use a minor mode. If it's a major mode, a major chord, I have to use a major mode or a major scale. Okay, so that's the basic kind of thing that you should be looking to do with the modes. So let's recap all that kind of information that we just covered. So there are 7 modes. 2 of them you should already know by now, which is the major and minor scale, which is Ionian and Aeolian. Okay. The 7th mode, Locrian, we haven't talked about today because that's down the road and it's not a mode that you need to focus on right now. Leaving us with 4 modes, or 4 colors if you will, to paint with. 2 of them being minor, which is Dorian and Phrygian, and 2 of them being major, which is Lydian and Mixolydian. Okay? And the way you should be practicing these is to take either a major or a minor scale and alter that one note in each mode to kind of give the modal sound. And then the next thing to practice is to switch from playing a regular major or minor kind of scale or sound to one of these major or minor kind of sounding modes. Okay. I plan on doing a few more of these videos hopefully, and there'll probably be a little bit more in terms of developing modal sounds and some backing tracks probably, and some kind of maybe some licks or something, I don't know. Depends on the comments and the views that I get for this video. You know, if no one's really interested in that stuff, then I'll do something else for my next video. Okay. Thank you for watching. Please share, like, subscribe. Do the thing that people do on social media, which I know nothing about. And have a good day. Good luck with your practice, and see you soon.